I never expected that a simple knock on my door would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It wasn't a dramatic, movie-style entrance or a fateful meeting in a crowded cafe. It was just a sound, a polite rapping of knuckles on wood, that unraveled the quiet, predictable tapestry of my existence and wove in a thread of something so vibrant it redefined the entire picture. Before that knock, my life was a series of well-worn loops, comfortable and safe, but distinctly lacking in color. I was a freelance writer, which is a professional way of saying I spent most of my time in a symbiotic relationship with my laptop and my favorite armchair. My name is Lucas. I was 28, and my world was largely confined to the four walls of my apartment, a space I had curated to be my sanctuary from a world that often felt too loud, too fast, too much. My routine was my armor. Wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk overlooking the bustling street I never felt a part of, and write. I wrote copy for websites, articles for obscure online magazines, and the occasional ghost-written blog post for a tech startup. The work was solitary, which suited me. It allowed me to observe the world from a safe distance, to analyze and arrange words without having to engage in the messy, unpredictable business of actual human interaction. My social life consisted of a bi-weekly video call with my sister and polite nods to my neighbors in the hallway. It was a small life, but it was mine. I told myself I was content, but in the quiet moments late at night, a feeling of deep, resonant loneliness would sometimes settle in my chest, a quiet hum beneath the floorboards of my carefully constructed piece. Let me take you back to how it all began. The catalyst for everything was him. Caleb. He lived 3 doors down from me on the 4th floor. He was, in every conceivable way, my opposite. While I was quiet and lived mostly in my head, Caleb was a creature of kinetic energy. I'd see him in the mornings, heading out for a run in shorts and a tank top, even when the air still had a brisk autumn chill. He was a personal trainer, a fact I'd gleaned from snippets of conversation I'd overheard in the mailroom. He seemed to radiate a kind of effortless confidence, the sort of self-assurance that comes from being perfectly at home in your own body. He was handsome, of course. It was an objective fact, like the sky being blue or the rent being due on the 1st of the month. He had dark, unruly hair that always looked like he'd just run his hands through it, and a smile that seemed to reach his eyes instantly, crinkling the corners in a way that felt genuine. I would sometimes hear the faint, thumping bass of music from his apartment in the evenings, a sign of life that was so different from the ambient silence of my own. He was the sun, and I was a planet in a distant, quiet orbit, content to observe his light from afar. I never imagined our paths would do more than briefly cross in the hallway, a quick exchange of hey, and a nod before we retreated back into our separate worlds. He was, in the grand, unspoken social hierarchy of our apartment building, completely out of my league. I assumed he was straight, that he had a string of equally athletic and beautiful girlfriends, and I filed my faint, persistent attraction to him in the mental folder labeled unrealistic daydreams. That's how life works sometimes, isn't it? You build walls and create categories to protect yourself from wanting things you're sure you can never have. The inciting incident, the moment the universe decided to throw a wrench into my meticulously ordered life, arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It was raining, a steady, dreary drumming against my window pane that perfectly matched my mood. I was struggling with a particularly dry piece on search engine optimization, and my brain felt like it was full of static. Then came the knock. It was hesitant, not the sharp, impatient rap of a delivery person. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, sinking back into the comfortable anonymity of my solitude. But a flicker of curiosity, an emotion I hadn't felt in a long time, prompted me to get up. I opened the door, and my carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. It was Caleb, but it wasn't the vibrant, energetic Caleb I was used to seeing. He was leaning heavily on a pair of crutches, his right leg encased in a bulky, imposing medical boot. His face was pale, and there was a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. His usual confident posture was gone, replaced by a slump of exhaustion and frustration. His eyes, which I had only ever seen from a distance, were a startling shade of green, and right now they were filled with a mixture of pain and embarrassment. "Hey," he said, his voice a little strained. "Sorry to bother you. I'm Lucas, from 4B." I almost smiled. Of course, I knew who he was. Caleb, I replied, my own voice sounding foreign to my ears. I'm Caleb, he managed a weak smile. Yeah, I know. Look, this is going to sound weird. He shifted his weight on the crutches, wincing slightly. I had a bit of an accident. Slipped on some wet leaves while I was out running yesterday. Fractured my ankle. He gestured down at the boot with one of his crutches. The doctor says I have to stay off it completely for at least a few weeks. I just stood there, nodding, unsure of what to say. This was the most we had ever spoken. He took a deep breath, and it seemed to cost him some effort. The thing is, he continued, looking at the floor before meeting my eyes again, I live alone. And I'm realizing there's a lot of stuff that's, well, kind of impossible right now. Like getting groceries. Or even just carrying a plate of food from the kitchen to the couch. It's pathetic. I know, he let out a short, humorless laugh. I felt a pang of something. Sympathy, maybe something more. The sun, it turned out, could be eclipsed. I was wondering, he said, his voice dropping a little, the confidence completely stripped away, leaving only a raw vulnerability. And please, feel free to say no, I can figure something else out. But would you be willing to help me out? Just for a little while? Just with the basics. I can pay you. Of course, the request hung in the air between us, charged and unexpected. My mind raced. This would mean disrupting my routine. It would mean letting someone into my space, or rather, entering theirs. It was everything my anxious, introverted self was programmed to avoid. But then I looked at him, at the genuine desperation in his eyes, and the fortress of my solitude suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. You don't have to pay me, I heard myself say, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. Of course I can help. We're neighbors, a wave of relief washed over his face, so potent it was almost tangible. The tension in his shoulders seemed to dissolve. Really? He asked, his voice thick with gratitude. Wow. Thank you. Seriously, Lucas. You're a lifesaver. And just like that, the predictable orbit of my life was broken. I had, without fully understanding the consequences, agreed to let the sun into my quiet, shadowed world. The door to my apartment, and to a part of my life I thought was permanently closed, had just been pushed wide open. The first few days were a study in awkward navigation, both physically for him and socially for us. My life, once a predictable loop, now had a new, recurring appointment. Caleb. I would text him in the morning to see if he needed anything, and then again in the evening to help with dinner. His apartment, which I had only ever imagined as some kind of hyper-masculine gym shrine, was a complete surprise. It was clean, for one thing. Impeccably so. And there were books everywhere. Not just fitness manuals and anatomy textbooks, but shelves filled with worn paperbacks, histories, classic novels, collections of poetry. On his wall, next to a framed poster of a mountain range, were several small, beautifully rendered charcoal sketches of cityscapes. It was not the home of the simple jock I had constructed in my mind. Our conversation started small, logistical. Do you need more milk? Can you grab that pan from the top shelf? But gradually, as the hours we spent together accumulated, the talk deepened. We moved from the kitchen counter to the comfortable expanse of his living room couch, a plate of pasta balanced on my lap, his leg propped up on a mountain of pillows. He told me about growing up in a small town in Oregon, about his passion for hiking, about how the injury felt like a betrayal by his own body, the one thing he had always been able to rely on. It's my job to help people feel strong, he said one evening, staring at his booted foot with disdain. And right now, I feel like the weakest person I know. It was in these moments of shared vulnerability that I felt the image I had of him shattering into a million pieces, replaced by the far more complex and compelling reality of the man sitting next to me. He wasn't just confident, he was also thoughtful. He wasn't just energetic, he was also deeply frustrated by his stillness. He asked me about my writing, and not in the polite, dismissive way most people did. He was genuinely curious. He asked to read something I had written, and my stomach twisted with a familiar knot of anxiety. I hesitantly showed him a short, personal essay I had written about the feeling of being an observer in your own life. I expected him to skim it, to offer a polite compliment and change the subject. Instead, he read it slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he finished, he looked up at me, his green eyes serious. "This is really good, Lucas," he said, his voice quiet. "I feel like this sometimes too. Like I'm just playing a part everyone expects me to play. That was a turning point. The admission hung in the air between us, a bridge built between his world and mine. It was a revelation of a shared secret, a quiet acknowledgement that the personas we showed the world weren't the whole story. The distance between us, which had once felt like a chasm, was shrinking with every shared meal, every late-night conversation. My initial attraction, which had been a thing of abstract fantasy, was now grounding itself in the reality of who he was. Kind, surprisingly sensitive, and carrying a quiet depth I never would have guessed at. The small, significant moments started to accumulate, like stones dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through the quiet surface of our interactions. One afternoon, I was rummaging through his cupboards looking for rice. He directed me from the couch, and as I reached up to a high shelf, my shirt lifted slightly, exposing a small patch of skin on my lower back. I felt his gaze on me, a sudden, focused intensity that was different from his usual friendly attention. It was just for a second, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I pulled my shirt down, my face flushing, and pretended not to have noticed. But something had shifted. The air was suddenly thick with unspoken possibilities. Another time, I was helping him change the dressing on a small scrape he'd gotten on his arm during the fall. My fingers were gentle as I cleaned the wound, and he was completely still, his eyes locked on my face. Our proximity was purely clinical, but it felt anything but. I could feel the warmth of his skin, smell the faint scent of his soap. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet of the room. When I finished, our eyes met, and for a long moment, neither of us looked away. It was a moment stretched taut with tension, a question hanging unanswered between us. These were the moments that I would take back to my own apartment at night, replaying them in my mind, searching for meaning. Was I imagining things? Was this just the strange intimacy that comes from caregiving? Or was it something more? My cautious heart, so used to the safety of solitude, was starting to feel the dangerous, thrilling pull of hope. A week turned into 2, and the routine of our days became a strange kind of domesticity. We fell into an easy rhythm, a comfortable dance of dependence and support. The initial awkwardness had melted away, replaced by a familiarity that was both comforting and terrifying. I knew how he liked his coffee, strong, with a splash of oat milk. He knew that I hummed under my breath when I was focused on chopping vegetables. We were living in a bubble, a temporary world created by his injury, and a part of me never wanted it to pop. I was happier than I had been in a long time, but my happiness was shadowed by the constant, nagging fear of what would happen when his ankle healed, when he no longer needed me. Would we just go back to being neighbors who exchanged polite nods in the hallway? The thought sent a chill of dread through me. The turning point, the moment that shattered the fragile bubble and forced us into a new, uncharted territory, happened on a Friday night. It was the end of my second week of helping him. I had made us a simple dinner, a spicy chili that he loved. We ate on the couch as usual, watching some mindless action movie he'd put on. The conversation was light, easy, but underneath it, I could feel a low-frequency hum of tension. We were both aware that the end of our arrangement was approaching. His doctor had said he could start putting weight on his foot next week. He was getting better. He wouldn't need me for much longer. After the movie ended, I started to clear away our empty bowls. It was my usual exit cue. I'd clean up the kitchen, say goodnight, and retreat to my own apartment to spend the rest of the evening overthinking every single thing we had said and done. I carried the bowls into his small, galley-style kitchen. It was a narrow space, barely wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side. I rinsed the dishes and placed them in the dishwasher, my movements methodical, automatic. I was trying to delay the inevitable goodbye. "Well, I should probably get going," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. I dried my hands on a towel, my back still to him. I could hear the soft thud and scrape of his crutches as he moved from the living room. I expected him to stop at the entrance to the kitchen, to say thank you and good night from a safe distance. Instead, he came all the way in, positioning himself in the narrow space between me and the only way out. I turned around, and my breath caught in my throat. He was standing so close I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. The air between us crackled, thick with all the things we hadn't said for the past 2 weeks. The ambient noise of the city outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of our breathing. My back was pressed against the cool metal of the refrigerator. I had nowhere to go. He leaned forward slightly, balancing his weight on his good leg and one crutch, using his free hand to brace himself against the counter beside me. We were enclosed in our own small world, the kitchen counters like canyon walls on either side. His face was inches from mine. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, a stark contrast to the cold of the fridge at my back. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. This was it. This was the precipice I had been walking towards for days. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at me, his gaze intense, searching. I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a vulnerability that mirrored my own. He was taking a risk. We both were. Then, he leaned in closer, his lips almost brushing my ear. His voice was a low whisper, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. "Stay," he said. Just that one word. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a demand. It was a plea. It was a confession. It was everything. In that single, whispered word, the entire dynamic between us was irrevocably altered. The line between caregiver and patient, between neighbor and friend, was completely obliterated. He had closed the kitchen, trapping me not just physically, but emotionally. And the most terrifying, most wonderful part was that I had absolutely no desire to escape. I just nodded, unable to form words, and watched as a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, a smile that finally, truly, reached his eyes. The world outside the kitchen, outside this one perfect, terrifying moment, ceased to exist. I stayed, but it wasn't what I had expected. There was no sudden, passionate kiss, no dramatic sweep into the bedroom. Instead, he slowly, carefully, pushed himself back, giving me space to breathe. The intensity of the moment lingered, but it softened into something else, something quieter and more profound. We went back to the living room, but the space between us on the couch felt different now. It was no longer a friendly gap, but a space charged with a new, acknowledged intimacy. We talked for hours. We talked about everything and nothing. We talked about our families, our fears, our dreams for the future. It felt like the conversation we had been having in bits and pieces for the past 2 weeks had finally found its true voice. All the subtext, all the unspoken questions, were now laid bare. There was a current of pure, unadulterated honesty flowing between us. He admitted he had noticed me in the building months ago, that he had been trying to work up the courage to talk to me for weeks before his accident. "I just didn't know how," he confessed, looking down at his hands. "You always seemed so self-contained, so in your own world. I was afraid you wouldn't be interested." It was almost dawn when I finally went back to my own apartment. I didn't sleep. I just lay in bed, replaying the entire night, especially that one moment in the kitchen. The feeling of his breath against my skin, the sound of his whispered plea. "Stay," it echoed in the silence of my room. But the morning brought with it a cold wave of anxiety. What did it all mean? Now that the confession was out, suspended in the air between us, what came next? The clarity of the late-night conversation began to feel murky in the harsh light of day, distorted by my own well-practiced insecurities. The next few days were excruciatingly awkward. The easy, comfortable rhythm we had established was gone, replaced by a stilted, careful dance. When I went over to his apartment, the air was thick with a new kind of tension. It wasn't the exciting, hopeful tension of before, but a nervous, uncertain one. We were both hyper-aware of each other. A casual brush of our hands while passing a salt shaker felt like an electric shock. We avoided looking each other in the eye for too long. He seemed to have retreated back into himself, and I, in turn, retreated into mine. The safe territory of our arrangement had been calebed, and now we were lost in a new, unfamiliar landscape with no map. My mind became a relentless analysis machine. I replayed the kitchen scene 1,000 times. The whisper, the look in his eyes. Had I misinterpreted it? Was it just a moment of profound loneliness on his part, a desperate need for human connection after weeks of isolation? Maybe he regretted it now. Maybe he had woken up the next morning mortified by his own vulnerability. The thought was a sharp, painful sting. My hope, which had soared so high, began to plummet, weighed down by the heavy anchor of my fear. I started to prepare myself for the inevitable end. His ankle was getting better. He was starting to limp around the apartment without his crutches. Soon, he wouldn't need me at all. I imagined the conversation. He would thank me for my help, maybe hand me an envelope of cash that I would refuse. We would shake hands, promise to stay in touch, and then slowly drift back into our separate lives, the past few weeks becoming nothing more than a strange, bittersweet memory. The thought of returning to my old routine, the quiet solitude of my apartment, now felt unbearable. He had shown me a world of color, and the idea of going back to black and white was devastating. My heart, which had just begun to open, started to close itself up again, a defense mechanism against the rejection I was now certain was coming. The tension finally broke on a Sunday evening. It was the last day of our official arrangement. He was scheduled to see his doctor the next morning and was expected to be cleared to walk without the boots soon. I had gone over to help with one last meal, my stomach in knots the entire time. The silence between us was heavier than ever. We ate quickly, barely speaking. I felt like I was suffocating. As I stood up to clear the plates, my hands trembling slightly, he spoke. "Lucas, can we talk?" His voice was low and serious. My heart sank. This was it, the goodbye I had been dreading. I sat back down, bracing myself. He didn't look at me. He just stared at his hands, which were clasped tightly on the table in front of him. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry for making things so weird between us this week. I didn't know what to say."